As you've heard, my name is Dave Peck. I'm the CEO of the Curriculum Foundation. We work with, we have the good fortune, the honour of working with governments around the world to help them develop national curricula. And that title is really this is the business that governments around the world are in. You know, it is now a global era. No country can afford to ignore that, and that is the curriculum that we are preparing. We have no choice. No country can afford to be left behind in that respect. So, a national curriculum for a global era is what I will talk about. Just briefly, the foundation, the Curriculum Foundation, I've told you where we work. We have a number of points I want to make to you about the foundation. The first one is that we're a not-for-profit organisation. There we are, yeah. A not-for-profit organisation in the UK. We have a number of, we are having some trouble jumping around here. That catchphrase there, a world-class curriculum for every learner, is one that we've adopted some time ago. This is what every young person deserves, isn't it? No young person deserves anything less than a world-class curriculum. When they go into an education system, wherever it might be, in a public school or a private school, they deserve nothing less than the best, do they? We've heard about diversity, you know, whether they're wealthy, whether they're poor, whoever they are, able, with special needs, every child deserves the best curriculum, a world-class curriculum. Now, what you can see there, these 5 blocks, this process, that's the focus of our work. So, curriculum principles, helping develop curriculum principles. Building upon those, the standards, or curriculum overviews, we sometimes call them. Taking that a step further and developing syllabuses. Assessment is absolutely key, isn't it? So these steps in the process are really important. Implementation, we've heard a fair bit about already today. Absolutely vital as well, that the quality of the implementation process. And lastly, evaluation. So we work at any or all of those phases with whichever government, whichever nation we happen to be working with at the time. Whoops, here we go again. But today, of course, we're working on that one, the second one. Seems to like to jump 2 at a time. The second one, which is standards. Okay? Right. Now, as you've just heard from Dennis, we've done this study comparing the curricula of Chile and Australia and the US, just to pull out some points which hopefully will be useful for writing teams here in Brazil. Nobody would want, I think, to set out on this road of trying to produce a new curriculum without learning the lessons that there are to be learned from governments everywhere. What do we find? And this applies to these 3 nations I've just mentioned, but in fact to everywhere you go. You know, broadly speaking, the vision and the aims of national curricula are the same. Every nation wants the best outcomes for its young people and wants them to be successful, wants them to be able to compete in the global economy. So there are similarities in terms of vision and aims, but there are also contrasting approaches, of course, and we've sort of been touching on those through today. the recipe that you come up with at the end of this process will of course be Brazilian, and that's how it must be. Ingredients that go into that curriculum recipe can be whatever, can't they? And you would want some of those ingredients to be pulled from the best examples around the world. So, there are contrasting approaches in different countries. There is also common areas of coverage and areas of overlap between one country and another. But similarly, there's diversity. You know, some countries leave this out. There are similarities and there are differences in what is taught when as well, of course. You know, some topics come up earlier in one country and later in another. And the last point on that slide, there isn't a right answer. You know, there is no right answer. And even when you get to the end of this process and you have your standards and you've implemented the curriculum, that won't be the right answer either, will it? In fact, it'll be the right answer for the time, we hope, but the curriculum has to continue to evolve. In a fast-changing world, you need a changing curriculum to keep up with it. And as we all know, it keeps on changing faster and faster. Okay. So, vision and rationale. The question that everyone is asking is broadly the same one, as I've said. So it's something like this. What do we need the curriculum to do for our young people to prepare them for the changing and much changed world that they're going to face as adults? The old-fashioned approach was to say, we'll teach children at school, and when they finish school, they will have learned what they need to know, and they can go off and be successful adults. No longer the case. All right? So, the business about the changing world, and of course it's all about the aspirations for the nation as well. You know, what are the aspirations for Brazil? If anyone's going to deliver it, they're probably in school now. Yeah? So, another key question to be asking at the start, and that leads to, when you've got the answers to those questions, when you've considered that, we come on to the, how can we capture this and put this, design a curriculum accordingly. Okay? So, at the moment we're talking about, today of course the focus is on standards. In the report I mentioned earlier on, we've gone on from there to think about the next step, which is a scope and sequence document. And I won't get into the complications, but you know, you may design your standards and then say we will produce a scope and standards document. Some countries combine the two. There are different ways of doing these things. And then move on after that from a scope and sequence document into detailed syllabuses, exactly what must be taught, the detail. You're not going to put the detail in the standards or in the scope and sequence document. What we should never forget, of course, is that the end point, where we want to be, when you've done this, is that virtuous circle. You've designed your curriculum, you've developed your curriculum, you've implemented it, and you then want to be going through a cycle of evaluating, are children learning what we want them to learn? What do we need to do about it? How will we adapt the curriculum to keep pace with change? So it's just worth bearing in mind that that's where we hope that we are headed. So a quick word about evaluation beforehand, there we are. We have to think about assessment when we're thinking about the curriculum. And the feedback that we want so that we can update the curriculum comes largely from assessment, of course. And it's really important to think about these things. What do we want to know? What's national assessment going to tell us about the curriculum? How are we going to get that feedback from national examinations? But at the other extreme, classroom assessment is really important, isn't it? The everyday classroom assessment for learning, what's that going to keep telling us? You know, that's the key curriculum development for children on a day-to-day basis is what happens in the classroom, isn't it? The teacher finds out how well children have understood. What have they got to do differently? How will teaching and learning have to be adapted to get these points across more effectively? And then, of course, there's anything between the two. Many countries have sort of regional assessment or school level assessment. And that's a really big job, isn't it? I thought I really ought to mention this now. It's a really big job to ensure that whatever levels of assessment you have are all consistent and coherent and do that job for you. So I'm jumping forward to assessment, but we cannot think about reviewing the curriculum without keeping assessment in our minds. So, let's move on again. Right, standards. What are the standards? The standards must be right. The job that you standards writing teams are about to undertake is a really important one. It's a really massive responsibility because, of course, everyone's going to teach to the standards you write. So, things to think about, and I'm sure some of the things I'm going to say you will already have thought about, of course, so I don't think everything I'm telling you is new. But hopefully some of the things I'm going to say will give you some reason to think, some cause to think. It's really important that the right expertise is there in those writing teams, and you've got your teams already, and it sounds as if the process that you've gone through has ensured that you have a team of experts there. A key issue is this one about who holds the pen. I'll come on to debates in a minute, but you could carry on debating the standards forever. And at some point, someone has to say, that's it, this is the standard. At some point, someone has to hold the pen and write it down, and that's it. And you're going at such a great pace that time is going to come very soon. So, you've already talked about learning from national experience, what's going on in the states and municipalities at the moment. That's obviously key. We've talked about learning from international experience. Of course, you'd want to do that. The curriculum we want to be consistent and coherent, of course, for all ages and all subjects. And that's a really important issue too, isn't it? You 116 people, if I've got the number right, obviously you can't just go off and write in your separate teams and come back and there's a curriculum or there's a set of standards, because they have to be consistent and coherent. So there has to be a process in place to make sure that happens, doesn't it? We can't have 160 or however many it is, 29 separate islands that mean that children's experience will be confusing. I could go on about all these things for much longer, but I mustn't. Something else we've mentioned several times is that bullet point there about standards being truly national. They must be owned. The curriculum, and this is a lesson that comes up everywhere we go, the curriculum cannot be something that the ministry does to teachers and to students. It has to be something that the whole education system across the whole of Brazil feels is theirs. And so that consultation thing that the point about consultation, I think can't be made too many times. Consultation must be really effective and really thorough so everyone feels they've had a say and no one feels they're having to implement a curriculum that's someone else's. We've got to get the standards right, but importantly, the foundations of the standards have to be right. So, the foundations. Well, there are lots of foundations, and I don't have time to talk about all of them, but across the nation there must be a clear vision of what this curriculum is for. There must be a set of aims of what we're trying to achieve with this curriculum. And of course, what are Brazilian values? What are the values that we're going to express in this curriculum that we want our children to absorb? Very important, isn't it? We talk about values shaping society. Well, we have to have them there in our children, don't we? Competencies. We've had a lot of talk about competencies, and I'm sure we'll talk more about them. One of the countries we worked in recently, I can tell you the writing team took probably a year to get clear in their heads what competencies means. It's not easy. Cross-cutting issues. What do we expect every single one of you writing teams to incorporate into your curriculum? If equality is one of your cross-cutting issues, then what contribution is science going to make and history going to make and so on? So these things must be clear so you know what you're doing from the start. Subjects and subject groupings, it sounds as if that's all quite clearly sorted already. And these things are often set out in a curriculum framework. All of those sort of basics are often set out in a curriculum framework. Now, I'll wave a couple at you. That's the curriculum framework from Rwanda, which was launched just a couple of months ago. I think I was there in March for that event. They were so sure about how they wanted to shape their curriculum. I don't know if you can see it, but on the front cover there it says competence-based curriculum. So they wanted it on the front cover, that's what it is. That's another one, that's South Sudan, and their curriculum framework has been produced in the last 12 months. And I don't think you have a curriculum framework as yet, but this is a document that ideally is something that's really digestible, that parents could look at and see, oh, I see what they're talking about. I understand the shape of the Brazilian curriculum. I can see the thinking that's gone into it. And children can understand it too. It's well worth putting your curriculum principles and your aims and your values and so on into a document like that. Now, as you can see on the screen there are a lot of things that can go into a curriculum framework, and some of them I've just mentioned now. And I won't read through the whole list because there isn't time. I'll run out of time. But let's pick out a couple that I'd like to highlight. One key one, I think, is that one. Whoops, just switched it off. If my pointer works properly, no. Sorry, I've messed that one up, Leonardo. One of those should say cultura e patrimonio. Did I say that right? That's another one of those issues, isn't it, that really you would want to make sure is clearly expressed. It's one of those things that makes the curriculum of each country specific to that country, and that each subject should be contributing to appropriately. What are the generic competencies? What are the competencies that every subject contributes to? Those things we were hearing about earlier from the survey. Business and industry, higher education say they want people who can think critically, who can communicate well, who can solve problems. Now, we need to be clear, what are the generic competencies that every subject is contributing to, so that is consistent and coherent and comes through in all of the standards from all the different subject teams. I think I better not, well, perhaps I'd pick on that one there, integrating ICT and technical and vocational education, TIC perhaps you call it here. But anyway, that's another key issue, isn't it, that needs to be sorted out beforehand. We cannot afford, really, to have any subject disconnected from ICT these days. But we need to be clear about what we're expecting in terms of the contribution from each subject at an early stage. Okay, so you'll have the presentation. I won't read through all of those. Right, what's going on here? Put your hand up if you had that kind of education. Were you an empty vessel, sat in a classroom, filled up with knowledge from the teacher's head? Yeah? And I show you this because this is another point which is at the heart of the movement that I've been talking about, this sort of global race to amend the curriculum. We can't have that anymore, can we? The minister just spoke about students in secondary school being bored. You know, I expect many of you in this room probably had that kind of education, yes? And I expect many of you also developed that skill of sitting there looking as though you are listening. Yeah? Looking as though you are listening, so that, I hope none of you are doing it now, but we can't have, that's not the way it can be, is it, anymore? We can't have a curriculum that is shaped like that. So what we need is one like this. That is the Irish poet, W.B. Yeats. I think there's somebody in the room who knew that, actually, last time I asked that question. But that's what he said. You know, education isn't filling a bucket, it's lighting a fire. So really what a classroom should be like is that, isn't it? Right? We shouldn't have all those people yawning or trying to hide their yawns. We should have all these people who are so fired up about education, they love it and they want more of it. Yeah? And there's a challenge. What's a curriculum going to look like if we really want everyone fired up Yeah? And what's the teacher's job in those circumstances? Well, it's a different job, isn't it? First, it's sort of igniting the spark, getting the fire lit, and then it's just going back there, and then it's fanning the flames. If you can ignite the fire, if you can get children fired up about education, and you can keep fanning the flames and getting them to love it more and more, then we'll end up with children who are addicted to lifelong learning. And we'll finish school, and we talked to, there was a question before, wasn't there, about, I think I might be addicted to fighting better education, or whatever the phrase was that we used earlier on. But we need children addicted, don't we, to learning. This learning is such fun, I want to carry on doing it forever. And teachers still do have that job. There's still some knowledge to be transmitted, isn't there? You know, this false dichotomy we keep on about, it is a false dichotomy. Knowledge matters just as much as it ever did. I'm glad that the pilot who flew me here had some knowledge, yeah? I'm glad the surgeon who operated on me had some knowledge, not just skills. So anyway, I won't go on about that, but that is shaping the way nations are thinking about the new curriculum. I'll just pick out this little point from the curriculum booklet from Singapore, and they have these two great phrases that I wanted to just mention. And the first one is that one, teach less and learn more. Sometimes when teachers doing that, what we said just now about, you just downloading knowledge, they're actually doing a lot of teaching, but there's not a lot of learning going on because everyone's switched off. So teach less and learn more, I think, is a great phrase, a great catchphrase. And the second one there, about preparing learners for the test of life and not for a life of tests, something else we've been getting wrong across the world, isn't it? We prepare children for tests. Well, Brazilian children don't need to be prepared for tests, they need to be prepared for life and success in life, don't they? And the same everywhere else around the world. So, well worth looking at some of the stuff that Singapore have produced. Some very good thinking gone into that. So, what do the standards have to include for learners? All of these things. I've already mentioned love of learning. Active learning and not passive learning. That doesn't mean always, but active learning that is really engaging, not just sitting passively, I've kind of mentioned. Lifelong learning, I've already mentioned. Adaptability and flexibility. If we want children who are going to be competent, we need them to be able to respond to whatever situation they might come across, don't we? They need to be able to face any challenge that they meet in school, in life, and that means being adaptable and flexible. We need them to have self-confidence and independence. We need them to be entrepreneurial and to take risks. Again, something that came up this morning was this business of being afraid to answer in case they got it wrong. We need children to think, I'm going to answer, and if I get it wrong, that's great, because it'll move us forward. Yeah? And we've also spoken about right answers and debatable answers. We need children to accept that it's not always a case of simply, that's the right answer. We don't have many absolutely right answers, as the Minister said just now. Now, I want to mention Bloom's taxonomy to you, which will be very familiar. We've got a room full of teachers. You've seen it all before. And you know about the levels, and so I won't dwell on those. But this is really important for the standards as well, isn't it? Because if we're writing standards, and we write the standards in the old-fashioned way, and we just have the bottom line, if all of your standards just say, know that, state, define, and so on. In fact, let's have a look at the next. I'm going to move on here. All right? When you're writing standards, the words you use are really important, aren't they? If you write a lot of standards which simply say things like, I wondered about doing this as a test for you and letting you decide which ones go where, but there isn't time for that. So, hurrying on, if you just write name, state, define, then it'll be one of those old-fashioned downloading into an empty vessel curricula, won't it? It'll be about remembering. What we want is for children to get into that deep learning, which means that they really have to engage their brains. So we want these kinds of words, don't we, like use and classify and organise and select and solve and compare and contrast. So that's a really key thing to think about when writing your standards. Okay, so let's hurry on then. So the standards, we've talked about the standards and learners, standards and the nature of learning. Well, Knowledge still matters. There still has to be remembering and understanding, of course, but deep learning, competencies, the standards have to express those competencies that will secure that deep learning. They have to include skills and attitudes and values, and children have to get that big picture of learning. What they mustn't do is think, oh, there's a subject there, I learn that subject, there's a subject there. They've got to understand that these are all connected together. It's one, learning is one big picture, isn't it? They have to understand that. So the standards should express that. Okay, now I must just make this point. A decision that has to be made is that one. How much of the curriculum is the national curriculum? How much of the curriculum does the standards cover? Because many countries around the world have had to think about that question. You need to make that decision. And the bit that isn't in the national standards is the bit that's left for regional, local, school variation. And that there needs to be some. And I've spoken before about the fact that in some countries the curriculum is overburdened. This is what happens. If we just move on there. Look, oops. Maybe that doesn't work on this one. It doesn't, okay. What actually happens is that this bit here, ends up growing and growing and growing. And actually the national curriculum ends up far bigger than the time there is for the whole curriculum. Okay? And that can't happen. And we've spoken to, I've spoken to teachers in countries where they've said, well, the curriculum's so big, we only have time to teach 75% of it. Or we only have time to teach 50% of it. It's just ridiculous, isn't it? How can you, we cannot allow that to happen. Okay, so I'm going to hurry on now. Balance and coherence is really key. Getting that balance, avoiding curriculum overload, ensuring that the local bit fits in. Another thing to avoid, by the way, is curriculum inflation, and that tends to happen where we add years go by and somebody says, we must add that in, we must add that in, and bit by bit the curriculum gets bigger and gets too big. I would suggest you should have a rule that if anything gets added, something has to be taken out to counterbalance it, so you avoid curriculum inflation. Right. So I must just deal with this, although I'll probably run out of time. But once you subject teams get started, you're going to have some really heated debates, perhaps even some strong arguments about this question of what is in and what is out. What has to be in, of course, is the essential, but that's the debate. What is the essential that needs to be in the curriculum? So just giving you these examples here, looking at those three subjects in the three countries, and I couldn't possibly try to cover even a tiny fraction of this, so this is a toe in the water of outcomes from that survey. But let's just, for example, under languages, and obviously it's English in Australia and the US, and it's Spanish in Chile, but phonemic awareness ends at grade 2 in Australia, it ends at grade 5 in the US, and it ends at grade 1 in Chile. Okay? Now, there's a lot of difference there. Decisions have to be made. What's right, what's wrong, you have to decide for yourselves. Australia includes visual communication, and the US and Chile don't include it at all. All right? So that's just one example, a couple of small examples from languages. In maths, all three countries cover Pythagoras' theorem. Do you remember that? Okay, it's there in all three countries. But in Chile, it's in grade 7. In Australia, it's in grade 8. In the United States, it's in grade 8. And in Australia, it's grade 9. Okay? Again, no right or wrong, but you have to make these decisions, don't you? You will debate it. The US includes the use of sines and cosines. Do you remember that? Yeah? At grade 8. In Australia, it's grade 10. And in Chile, it's not in the basic curriculum. All right? And just an example from science as well. So Australia introduces the particulate nature of matter in grade 8. Chile does it in grade 6. And in US, the Common Core doesn't include science, so we can't say. But just to make the point, there are similarities, there are differences. You've got some serious debates to be had and lots of decisions to make. And as we've been hearing, you haven't got long to make them about what to include and where to include it. So, what's in and what's out? That's where your heated debates will happen, as I've already said. What can be included, what can go. What you need, what must drive this, I would suggest, is you need a curriculum which is narrow enough that you can easily complete it in the time available. No teacher should ever have to say, and this might be familiar to teachers in the room, no teacher should ever have to say, oh, I'm sorry that we've got to rush this, but we've got so much to do. It shouldn't happen, should it? What a thing to say to children. I mean, you're basically saying, I'm going to bore you now, aren't you? Yeah? So, avoid overload, and use subject specialists in those teams. You know, national interest, young people's learning, has to sometimes come first, doesn't it? And your subject specialists' loyalty to your subject, you know, the sort of, we must include everything. I'm a scientist, we must include every little bit of science. That you have to think about those things. Okay, so, a lot rests on the standards of the quality of the standards. So much of your outcomes of this process depend on the quality of the standards. The specifications for the standards have to be somewhere, and I would suggest a curriculum framework document of some sort would be a useful thing, as I've said to you already. And important thing is, how do we ensure that the standards are written in such a way they meet all of the specifications that we've just been through. That was a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but those are the decisions that we need to make. And there we are on the screen now. If we just go to there, you've got to think about, is it year by year? I think that's already decided. Are the curriculum and are the standards and the scope and sequence combined, or are they separate documents? Absolutely key is getting the terminology consistent. All right? We've been using the word curriculum, we've been using the word standards. We've got to be sure that we're all using the same standard definitions as we go through this process. So that's really important too. Okay, so how are you going to present them, in a table or in text? I'm sure that they may well have been discussed and decided already. And something to think about is that next step of syllabuses. But I think we'll leave syllabuses for now. And there's decisions to be made as to whether they are national or whether they are local as well. I won't go into the detail because there isn't time. So, sorry to rush you. See what I've just said? I said no teacher should ever say it. Sorry to rush you through that, but thank you for listening.